Once again, welcome everyone. My name is Ashley Klein Jimenez. My pronouns are she and her. You are joining us for Centering Survivors for Transformative Change, exploring economic supports to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence with FreeFrom. Prevent Connect is a national project of Valor US, formerly known as the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, or Valor. We have some objectives for you all today. We are aiming to be able to describe the connections between survivor-supportive and survivor-centered economic security and preventing SV and IPV. We also want to look at what are some of the strategies for sexual and intimate partner violence prevention, and then thinking about what are the opportunities and challenges for our own organizations to really think about how we support financial security when we're serving survivors and when we're trying to prevent violence as well. So that is what our conversation is going to revolve around today. But I do want to just share with you all that, economic support, strengthening economic supports is a strategy that we've been really interested in for a while now. And so we do have some past web conferences and resources that we're going to be sharing links to in the chat. We've been talking about how do we organize around economic opportunities? How do we get started in thinking about economic opportunities for sexual and domestic violence prevention? And we have some good examples of what folks have been doing across the country. We also have some blog posts. Tori wrote a blog post on economic security and safe relationships, looking at the pathways and actions for preventing intimate partner violence. We explored a conversation around paid leave and rent stabilization and how that really strengthened economic security and advanced violence prevention. We also did a web conference not too long ago about how do we even talk about these connections? How do we message the connection between preventing violence and economic security? How do we get stakeholders on board? How do we convince people that this is actually a strategy that works, that's important? And then we've also looked at some of the economic impacts of COVID-19 on sexual and intimate partner violence prevention. And then finally, just a couple of months ago at the National Sexual Assault Conference, there was a great workshop on living wages and really thinking about how do we, in this movement, start to pay people a living wage? How do we advance equity in our organizations around economic security and economic support and economic justice? And so API Chaya brought a lot of really important wisdom and experience to actually going through a process like that in a nonprofit. So I invite you all to take a look at that recording if that's something that interests you. I do want to also share that, it's the last week of October, but it is still Domestic Violence Awareness and Prevention Month, and NRCDV theme for DVAM this year is No Survivor Justice Without Racial Justice. We had the opportunity to talk with Arlene Massell and Casey, who's with us today, about this theme and really what it means, how it connects to prevention. And so we'll share the podcast recording if you'd like to listen to that. But Sheena and Casey, I do want to invite you in to just talk a little bit about the theme of no survivor justice without racial justice, because I think it ties in really well to the conversation that we'll be having today.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Yeah, we are really grateful to the Domestic Violence Awareness Project Advisory Group for challenging us to really turn up the heat on our call to action from last year, which was no survivor justice without racial justice. And we feel very strongly that this theme really reflects our commitment, both organizationally and as a movement, I think, at this time, at the intersection of these twin pandemics of COVID-19 and racial injustice, to really re-examine how our work can look different and how our work must look different to center those most impacted. And that starts with doing our internal work around racial justice. So really happy for the opportunity to emphasize this here for Domestic Violence Awareness Month.
Thank you so much, Casey. And thanks, Tori, for putting links to that. I did actually, thinking about the connections between racial justice and economic justice, we'd love to actually hear our audience's thoughts. And so our first text chat question is, where do you see the connections between racial justice and economic justice? We'd love to know how you see those connections, any maybe work or partnerships or collaborations that you're involved in, how you're connecting racial justice and economic justice as prevention strategies. We'd love to get your insight into that. I know it's a question that might take a moment for people to think on, so we'll definitely come back and see what's coming up in the chat. But I did want to move to our next slide, which is really highlighting, the CDC violence prevention technical packages, both the Stop SV technical package and the Preventing IPV technical package, do point to strengthening economic supports as either an approach or a strategy. So in Stop SV, it's an approach under providing opportunities to empower and support girls and women. And in the IPV technical package, it's a strategy, right? Strengthening household financial security and strengthening work-family supports are strategies and approaches that are really emphasized as being showing evidence that can prevent violence. And so there's really kind of been this shift to thinking, as we think about community level approaches, to think about what are the economic issues that we are being faced with, and how does that impact our prevention activities and strategies? And in the technical package, it shows us that these actually are strategies and approaches in and of themselves. Casey and Sheena, I want to bring you into this conversation too, because I know NRCDV has been doing a lot of work around looking at the strategies in the technical package and really understanding how racial and economic justice have to really kind of happen simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Ashley. I'm so glad you're raising this question and making this connection. And I'm seeing in the chat that people are sharing around sort of that intersection of racial and economic justice. And somebody gave an example of the Land Back movement as a perfect example of working at that intersection. And I would emphasize that too. And I think for me, I reflect on the fact that working at the intersections of racial and economic justice involves our outward facing work. So what do our programs look like, but also involves, transforming our organizations and our structures. And that's why, I'm really excited to hear and learn from FreeFrom's model for doing this kind of work and what it looks like in practice. I would invite Sheena, if you have additional reflections to offer on that intersection, to chime in. So just to say, really, to me, this is how you walk the talk, is at this important intersection. And I'm so glad that CDC is really emphasizing and embracing this strategy when it comes to our prevention work, because I think it was something that wasn't as in the forefront of our prevention work over time. And so the fact that we're moving in this direction, I think, is really important.
Thanks, Casey. And I know that, I mentioned NRCDV is doing a lot of work around not only looking at what's impacting communities and strategies to prevent intimate partner violence within communities, but also, like you said, really looking internally. How are our organizations structured in a way to uphold some of these harmful things, and how do we start to really look internally and think about what those structures could look like in a different way. And you all are going to be actually holding an event, a national prevention town hall. Would you share a little bit about that with us?
I would be happy to. Thank you so much for the invitation. I hope that all of you are going to be able to join us, as we close out Domestic Violence Awareness Month this year with our second National Prevention Town Hall. And this is highlighting the innovative prevention work that's being done in the southern region of the United States to really promote transformative change, as Ashley is talking about, that really centers BIPOC survivors. And so on day one, we'll be talking about what survivor-centered prevention looks like, what that is, what it is in practice. And then on day two, we'll be really digging into transforming our agencies to center racial justice. So exactly that work and the work that we're going to learn from FreeFrom about what they're doing in order to do that. So I believe, Tori's already shared the link to register there in the chat, and you can take a look at the program that we have planned. But we're really looking forward to digging into what does it look like to actualize this work in our programs and in our agencies. And I'll also just highlight too that our November TA question of the month that will be coming out was actually authored by FreeFrom. So thank you so much. And want to put in a little plug for that. You can access that on the VONET website, and it's going to be about why create survivor-centered workplaces in the gender-based violence movement. So really talking about what survivor-centered workplaces look like, which I know we're going to learn more about today. I'll pass it over to you, Sheena.
Thanks, Casey. Sorry about that earlier. The joys of technology that they bring us right now, right, everyone? So hopefully, just having an opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the housing work that NRCDV is engaged in and how it connects to the work that FreeFrom is also engaging in, and that partnership, that relationship we're developing with them. Hopefully that will connect back to the point that you are also speaking to earlier. So, despite the many challenges that Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities have had over the course of centuries, we know that they've been very creative in finding flexible ways to provide collective care for members of their communities, right? And so NRCDV is really exploring this through our racial justice work and the partners that we're engaging with, particularly when you are looking at the work that we are doing through our National Capacity Building Center on Safe and Supportive Housing for Domestic Violence Survivors. And so the Capacity Building Center has the goal to improve responses for survivors of domestic violence and their families across the continuum of publicly and privately funded homeless services and housing programs. And so, again, we know that a big part of that is going to be flexible. We know that flexible economic supports is one of the means to accomplishing this particular goal that's noted under the Capacity Center, accomplishing this goal through prevention and intervention measures. So the birthing of this goal that I just spoke about is concluded upon based on the demonstrated needs mentioned here on this slide. So safe, accessible, and affordable housing and the economic means to maintain stable housing. Domestic violence programs needing assistance or reporting that they are having difficulties in helping survivors navigate housing programs and in accessing resources. We also see a need in this work around housing, where housing programs are struggling to meet competing demands, and they are lacking survivor-centered or trauma-informed and culturally appropriate approaches. Many programs are mainstream programs very often and can perpetuate the same oppressive and discriminatory practices that we know hinder survivors, particularly survivors of color, from accessing housing. And then there are strong correlations between domestic and dating violence, racism, housing instability, and of course, economic security, again, resulting in some of those disparate outcomes for Black, Indigenous, and people of color survivors and their families. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And so on this slide, under that capacity building center, and again, I'm just trying to set some context for you all, background information. Under that capacity building center is the Domestic Violence Housing and Technical Assistance Consortium. And this consortium is a vehicle under the capacity building center that I just mentioned that is being used to highlight survivors' housing needs and lift up creative, again, and flexible ways in doing so. So through our collaborative approaches with, we call it the DVH Tech partners, as you can see, there are a number of federal partners listed as a part of this collaboration and technical assistance partners who I've noted on this particular slide. In collaboration with these partners, as well as our on-the-ground community engagement efforts, NRCDV is being a lot more or very intentional to analyze and be actionable, I think, as Casey mentioned, in doing this work through a racial equity lens and really centering the voices and needs of BIPOC survivors. So these intentional efforts are informing or leading the ways in which we're engaging with partners, such as those from FreeFrom. Again, much of what we've seen out of this housing conversations with BIPOC survivors and mainstream programs really echoes the work that FreeFrom is doing and what has been a long time need for flexible funding and direct cash assistance. So hopefully I have another a graphic here on the slide that really talks about the cycle of housing insecurity. And this information was captured from a study conducted by Dr. Nkiru, and the information can be found on the Safe Housing Partnerships website, which is also noted here. And so just again, keeping in mind the connection of all these pieces and this cycle of that you see here of getting housing and then keeping, being able to keep housing and losing it, and then, back again to where housing is finally stabilized. I'm going to turn it over to, I'm going to actually turn it back over to Tori so that she can bring us further into the FreeFrom conversation with our colleagues, and they can share more about how their work is really aimed at dismantling this survivor experience.
Thank you so much, Sheena. Go ahead, Ashley.
Sorry, I was going to intercept Tori just because before I turn it over to you, I just wanted to thank, Sheena and Casey. We really look to you all at NRCDV and your leadership around IPV prevention and housing security. I know this is work that you all have been doing for a long time, and your work is always so intentionally kind of centered around advancing racial justice as a prevention strategy. So really just wanted to thank you for sharing about your work around housing insecurity. And Tori, there's been so many great things coming up in the chat. I was wondering if you had a chance to look at any themes that were coming up.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. And yeah, there were a lot of great things in the chat, and I see Casey acknowledge that in the chat too. I really appreciate the comment from Angie about the connection between redlining and funding schools from property taxes. When we talk about how schools can be an avenue for prevention, I think that's a great way to connect economic and racial justice. Also, Lauren's comment of economic and racial justice are intertwined, and to fight for one, we need to fight the other. I remember recently on a Prevent Connect web conference, we were about health equity. Folks were talking about how how difficult it can be in partnerships when partnerships are only focused on the gender pay gap and they're not focused on the racial pay gap as well too. So to fight for economic justice means to also fight for racial justice too. So thank you, Lauren, for bringing that up. And then, you know, folks are also bringing up a lot of tools and things that, you know, maybe are, sorry if you can hear the trash can, I'm going to cut my earphones. You know, a lot of tools that can be coming up from a place of oppression that maybe seem good on the outside, but that aren't advancing racial justice. So Ashley, that's some of what I saw. Did you see any other themes that I missed?
Tori, I mean, thank you so much for highlighting those. I'm kind of reading through, going back and reading through, and just seeing kind of, you know, how folks are really thinking about the connections, how people are responding to economic disparities and how they're connecting that as kind of tools to continue racial injustice. So yeah, I'm gonna continue looking through, but thanks for pulling out some of those themes.
Yeah, and thanks to our audience for responding. If another idea sparks for you, feel free to add that in the chat. But I am really honored to finally introduce our guest for today's web conference, Tanya Ventura. Tanya is the Director of Service Provider Engagement and Education at FreeFrom. And Tanya, I know that you have a brief agenda to get us started, so I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me and for setting up this webinar so beautifully, everybody. My name is Tanya Ventura. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a survivor myself, daughter of immigrants, and I live in LA, so I'm joining from LA. What brought me joy this morning is waking up to rain. I know that doesn't bring many people joy, but it brought me joy. And today on our agenda we're going to do a quick intro to FreeFrom. We're going to then jump into financial capacity building within the movement. And don't worry, I'm going to explain what that means. Building survivor-centered workplaces. And yes, please check out that blog that's going to come out on NRCDB's website. And then collective power, systems change. And then if we have time, we'll jump into the Q&A. I do want to give everybody a heads up that we are going to be talking about money today, and specifically the crossover between the service provider experience, survivorship, and financial challenges. So if at any point you feel uncomfortable or you need to step away, please feel free, take care of yourself in whatever way you need to, grab some water, grab some snacks, stretch, do whatever you need to. And just wanted to flag that there might be some challenging content in the next few slides. Okay, next slide. A little bit about FreeFrom. We envision a world where survivors have sustaining income, savings, and credit with which to build wealth and the resources to support individual, intergenerational, and community healing. And to that end, we take a very holistic and diverse approach using technology, peer-to-peer programs, training programs, policy advocacy, social enterprise model. So if you got any holiday shopping to do, go over to our website and check out our social enterprise, all products made by survivors, and cross-sector solutions. So we love collaborating with other sectors. Next slide, please. I know this is probably just going to be some review, but and I'll go over it quickly just to catch us up on time. But nationally, we know that 1 in 2 trans folks experience gender-based violence or intimate partner violence, and we know that 1 in 4 women experience intimate partner violence. Next slide. When it comes to BIPOC women, girls, femmes, and LGBTQ plus femmes, women's and girls, the averages are a little bit higher. So 41.2% of Black women experience IPV, 40% of lesbian women experience IPV, 60% or up to 60% of Native American women experience IPV, and 61% of bisexual women experience IPV. And for these slides, it's mostly going to be focused on women, girls, and femmes, but just know that, again, 1 in 2 trans people, 1 in 7 men experience IPV. Next slide. And then going back to the gender and racial wealth gaps, because like the folks who spoke before me said, you cannot leave this conversation out or this part out in this conversation. So I'm going to quickly go over this, but for every $1 white men earn, Asian women only earn 90 cents, Black women earn 62 cents, Native American women earn only 57 cents, and Latinx women earn only 54 cents. And then the next one is for ownership. So like wealth ownership. For every $1 white men own, Black and Latinx women only own pennies, and Native American women own less than 1/10 of the median wealth of all Americans. So really, all those stats are there to show you the huge intersection between gender, racial, wealth gaps, survivorship, and how expensive it is to be a survivor. So not only are survivors indebted because of all the harm that they were subjected to, but also are experiencing, just because of the history of our country, our very white supremacist history of our country and capitalist history of our country, survivors really have compacting economic challenges that we'll talk a little bit more about today. So next slide. So we did some data, and you'll learn a little bit about our love for data in the coming slides, but we asked survivors because we wanted to know what really is the cost of economic abuse. And if any of you are curious about what economic abuse is, it's pretty much another control and power tactic used by harm doers to really take any financial choice, financial power away from a survivor. So we asked them, like, what is this cost? We know that 98% of survivors report being subjected to economic abuse. And we also know from the CDC that the average cost reported by survivors is about 104K. So we really wanted to know, like, what does that 104K look like, and what does it look like month to month, year to year, all that. So on average, survivors reported that harm doers steal 1,280 from them each month. That's each month, whether they are with that person or not. Even leaving, they can still be stealing a survivor's money. Harm doers restrict their freedom to spend an additional 1,090 of their own money as they see fit each month. Harm doers incur about 16,000 in coerced or fraudulent debt in their names each year. So this means harm doers have maybe taken out credit cards or loans, either coerced a survivor or without their knowledge, and are just racking up this debt in the survivor's name. And that survivors lose out on about 23,000 of income every year. So on top of the $104,000 that the CDC found, now we're seeing even more monthly and yearly costs. So pretty much all is to say is being subjected to economic abuse is extremely, extremely expensive. And we're more than happy for you to use this data as a tool to really make the case about why intimate partner violence, gender-based violence is an economic justice issue. Next slide. So what are we doing? We have 4 pillars that we exist in. So the first is building a sustainable movement. So supporting the anti-violence movement and centering economic security for all survivors and building their own financial capacity. So when we talk about financial capacity, it's really an agency's ability to do financial related work with survivors, but also to support the financial well-being of the people who work in their agency or in their agencies. Growing our collective power, which means creating tools, resources, and the environments to support survivor collective economic and community power. And we'll talk a little bit about what we're doing there later on. Catalyzing societal change, so bringing in our society's institutions as part of the ecosystem of support for survivors. So this means making sure that survivors have more access points to support that are not just limited to GBV agencies or traditional places of support. Advancing culture change, which means data collection, storytelling, and research to shift the narrative from crisis response to systemic change. So this is the part where I'm saying that we love data. So all of our work is really infused by the voices and the experiences, not only of our staff who are survivors, but of the people that we support. So we do everything based on what survivors tell us they want and need. And that's why data collection, storytelling, and research is such an important part of all the work that we do. And I'll hand it back over to Tori.
Thank you, Tanya. This was such a great groundwork and foundation to bring to us today, and having it all rooted in that data and storytelling is really powerful. because I know sometimes it can get a little fuzzy for folks to make those connections between economic justice, financial independence, and what that looks like for prevention. So I really appreciate you, starting your presentation with that. Ashley, we have a question for our audience.
Yes, we do. So we would love to hear from you all about your thoughts around policies and practices that support survivors' financial independence. How does that relate to prevention? How can policies and practices that support survivors' financial independence prevent sexual and intimate partner violence? Tori pasted that wording in the chat. Tori, I think we'll let people marinate on this for a few minutes and maybe check back in with me in a little bit to see what's coming up.
That sounds good to me, Ashley. As folks are marinating, I am going to bring Tanya back into the conversation. Can you tell us more about what this financial capacity building looks like?
Yeah, so financial capacity building, it is such a jargony word. So I apologize for that, y'all, if you don't know what this means. But if you think about capacity, let's just think about capacity. So maybe you're thinking about you're in a restaurant and you see that sign of how many people could be sitting in that restaurant at one time, right? And then you think about finances. So then you're thinking about how much financial ability, how much financial room, how much financial work is being done, and then building. So that's a practice of constantly working on something or growing something. So together, what we're really talking about is supporting both agencies, survivors, and key stakeholders and community leaders in really thinking about how are we committing to the financial growth and well-being of both the people we serve, but also the people that we employ. So that's really what financial capacity building means. And within this pillar is things like training, technical assistance, research. Research isn't all of them. I'm just going to say that right now. But research that really supports people who want to kind of build this financial capacity muscle. All right. Did we want to pause to look at people's answers, or sorry, I don't want to keep going if people still want to chat.
Ashley, I see a handful of responses have come in. Do you feel like we have enough to start pulling out themes, or do you want to wait?
We can pull out some themes right now. So I think one thing that Emily said is economic justice is gender justice, and so really just all of this is connected, right? We cannot work to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence without getting to these roots, without looking at all forms of oppression. I think that there's some folks pointing to that policies that are really put in place to strengthen economic support for people kind of takes away some of the methods that people use to exert power and control over others. And so taking away some of that would make, that not an option. I think too that, sometimes what I'm seeing is that there are situations that people really need help with being able to leave and to not have to make decisions to survive based on finances. And so being able to provide people with what they need makes it less likely that they would have to make decisions like that. There's more stuff coming in, but Tori, those are some of the things that I'm seeing right now.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, I see some more coming in about, job guaranteed leave for safety. And that being a huge connection between financial independence and preventing sexual and intimate partner violence. Tanya, can you tell us some of the common practices? And then I think you have some other, workplace practices and a roadmap for financial security in the movement.
Thank you. So going back to what does financial capacity building work, before we kind of really get into that roadmap, I wanted to just bring some attention to some common workplace financial practices that maybe we don't really always think about, like, oh yeah, that is money related. So just kind of bringing it to the forefront of our minds. But conversations with survivors about employment, housing, public benefits, housing came up earlier. Housing is very much tied to money and finances. Anything related to salaries, hourly rates, including submitting time cards, organizational and program budgets. So a lot of managers, directors, C-level staff engage in those types of practices, grant writing and reporting, money conversations among teammates, whether that's about the folks that you serve or each other, employee benefits and policy. So looking through your employee manual or handbook, there's definitely a lot of policies in there that impact somebody's financial well-being. Hiring, so whether you are hiring survivors or not, hiring is very much a financial practice. And staff turnovers, right? Because staff turnovers have not only emotional and physical impacts, but also financial impacts in an agency and the folks that we serve. So what others can you think of? And I'd love for you to drop them in the chat, because I'm sure I missed a lot of workplace financial practices. So if you can think of any others, you can definitely drop them in the chat. All right, next slide. So on the note of loving research, we just launched in July a report called Prioritizing Financial Security in the Movement and IPV, a roadmap. And some of the goals for creating this research, and it was a 2-year project with, at the time it was called HCIDLA, which is kind of like the housing and shelter authority or funder in LA City, Citibank, and Cal State Long Beach. So it was a partnership between the 3 of us for 2 years. And the goals was the number one obstacle to safety for survivors is financial insecurity. We knew that from our work. It follows then that the key to safety, and in particular long-term safety, is financial security. So when you think about financial insecurity, we think about how does that impact housing? How does that impact your access to getting to school? How does that impact being able to access different healing services? So like going to the doctor or seeing a therapist, et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, financial security is needed for all those things. The goal of this report is to illuminate what will enable staff working in the intimate partner violence movement to prioritize client economic security, and from there provide a roadmap for what building financial work could look like. And let me tell y'all, this is a very long 100+ report, so we're not going to get a chance to review everything on it, but we're going to review some of the main findings that we found in this report. And I think the link got dropped in the chat. So if you're interested, definitely check that out. Some of the key findings from this report, the 4 key findings from this report, was number 1, staff working in the IPV movement or the intimate partner violence movement are not able to support clients in building financial security as much as they would like. But given the opportunity, they have very clear ideas of what more they could do and the willingness to do it. Number 2, the key obstacle to prioritizing financial security at an organizational level revolve around the lack of flexible funding. And somebody mentioned flexible funding in the intro. I think a few folks mentioned flexible funding in the intro of this webinar. Funding specifically for financial work with clients and training staff is needed, along with more unrestricted funding to foster greater innovation. So innovation, or the lack of being able to get creative, and really make changes to programs when needed, was really tied back to funding, and a lot of folks made that connection between the two. Number 3, the key obstacle to individual staff doing more financial work are a lack of training and financial education, and the need for greater financial security for themselves. So staff are saying they need financial training and education, but also they need to be more financially secure in order to be able to do financial security work with survivors. They feel ill-equipped to teach what they have not experienced. And we'll get a little bit into what that means. Number 4, prioritizing financial security in the movement requires meaningful investment in staff well-being. We must begin by acknowledging that many staff not only experience financial insecurity, but also identify as survivors. Next slide, please. So then we got curious. We asked average number of clients assisted with various types of financial work. So to give you a little bit of an overview, this study was done in LA and Orange County in California. And we asked them, we gave them a list of like all these different financial practices or financial services that someone could possibly do with a survivor. And these were the most common responses. So on average, no one is really helping clients with identity fraud, support for gig or contract work, small business education, and all that comes with that. On average, a few clients were being assisted with saving and building savings plan, opening different bank accounts, credit building or repair, paying down debt, and all the aspects of job acquisition. And then on average, some clients were assisted with financial literacy and budgeting. So I think the important thing to note here is that no one really said that they were helping all clients or most clients. At minimum, we got some clients getting financial literacy support and budgeting. And I think it's really interesting that somebody already pointed out in the chat some of the challenges with financial literacy when it comes to survivor populations and some of the budgeting challenges that come with financial literacy when working with survivor populations. So back to the key finding of number 1, and next slide. Service providers know financial insecurity is a problem, right? And they know that survivors have financial needs. So they know that the number 1 need for their clients is building income. They knew that the number 2 need is budgeting. Number 3, managing debt. Number 4, building savings. And number 5, building and repairing credit scores. However, they are unable to do all these financial things because of all those reasons that they explained. So lack of funding, lack of training, lack of financial security for themselves. So there's a clear disconnect between what staff know survivors need when it comes to financial support and what they can actually do and what the support that they can actually offer. So as you can imagine, and maybe some of you feel it, it can be very frustrating, very difficult to know that your clients or the survivors that you work with have very specific financial needs that you want to be able to support with, but you just cannot at the moment. So we're really trying to think about how do we create a roadmap to be able to provide that. Next slide. So we asked staff, what would it take to prioritize client financial security? And they said, number 1, expanding funding specifically to target the financial security of clients. So like I said, a lot of service providers pointed back to funding as one of the most impeding challenges to being able to do financial security work with survivors. Number 2 is training and resources for staff on assisting clients with income building, debt management, credit repair, et cetera, et cetera. Number 3 was greater financial security for staff. And I think that one was really kind of, I don't think many of us expected it to be so high up in what folks needed to be able to do this work, but we'll get into a little bit about why that might be so high up in being able to do this work. And I'm sure some of y'all who are doing this work can relate to needing greater financial security for yourself. And number 4, more flexible funding. So this is specifically flexible funding that goes to survivors. So flexible cash grants directly to survivors. Next slide. Financial capacity building offerings that we have in this space to really support people with the training and aspect fees is we can provide training and webinars to agencies. Y'all can contract us to lead special workshops, trainings on any financial topic really, and also really helping agencies understand what is staff's relationship to money, what is the agency's relationship to money, and how does that impact the work that we're doing with survivors. These typically start at $800 an hour, but we can work with different budgets. And then the other offering that we have is special projects and consultations. So contracting FreeFrom as a subject matter expert to assisting with a project. So like research, launching a new program, organizational change efforts, or maybe you want to start your own flexible funding, you can definitely hire us and we can provide a project price quote. But we also have some free offerings, so don't worry. Next slide. So the free offerings that we have is you can become a member of our newest Starting From Within listserv. And this listserv is really to connect with other service providers committed to advocating for living wages and healthy work conditions in the anti-violence movement. So you can go on there and pose a question like, how have y'all convinced your C-level staff to provide living wage raises? or is there any data that has been useful, or stuff like that, that can really be supportive for people who are really trying to make those types of changes at their agencies. You could also sign up for our service provider newsletter to receive information, tips, info on free webinars, and resources about doing financial security work with survivors. We actually have a free webinar coming up next month where we'll have 3 guest speakers who have unionized at their IPV agencies or at their anti-violence agencies, which is very exciting to think about how unionizing can really support agencies in this movement to become more survivor-centered and financially equitable. And then you can sign up for upcoming Q&A with FreeFrom and peers, which is almost like small support groups for service providers on different topics. So for example, we've had topics like how to support folks or yourself in paying off student loans, how to support survivors with credit building. So it's very much like a support group for service providers to come together, ask each other questions, and really knowledge share and support each other in real time. And you can use that link that was dropped in the chat to sign up for any of the above. Next slide.
Thank you, Tanya. This is such a wealth of information, and I feel like especially the roadmap stuff that you went over too provides a lot of opportunities for folks to think about what is the work they're doing out in the community and what is the work that they're doing within their own organizations. And I understand that, oh, and I see that your colleague Sharon has posted a link in the chat to sign up for the webinar about labor unions coming up. So that's great. Thank you for adding that to the chat. So I heard you talk about it a little bit of how, survivors who work in the movement are noting that their own financial insecurity keeps them from being able to provide those lessons for the survivors that they serve. So I'm wondering, what does building survivor-centered workplaces look like for you?
Yes, thank you so much. So survivor-centered workplaces are pretty much workplaces that account for the survivor experience, but also commit to kind of taking on the responsibility of undoing some of the financial harm that comes from just being subjected to violence. Next slide. And the reason why that's important in the movement is because in that study that I was just talking about, 1 in 2 staff members we spoke to identified as survivors. So that's higher than the national average, right? So that means that a lot of survivors are working in our movements and at our agencies, whether they talk about it or not. I think it's important to account for that whenever we are thinking about any workplace practices, policies, et cetera, et cetera. 1 in 4 staff who identified as survivors reported still being in contact with their harm doer. And 1 in 5 staff members do not feel completely safe at home. And to make all of this a little bit more challenging, the average salary reported by staff from the folks that participated in this research was $35,436 after tax, which means that on average, none of the staff in our study currently earn enough to support themselves and a child. And I'd like to point out here that the majority of the people who participated in the study were also Latinx and also identified as women. So we're also getting into the racial and gender wage gap disparities. And I think it's important to note that we might not intentionally be wanting to create more economic harm, but when we are not paying living wages to people, specifically survivors, we are not aiding in the recuperation of all that financial harm that happens when someone survives violence. Next slide. And I just want to read this quote from a service provider who I think really connected all of this. So I feel like if we were all financially secure, that we could all work better because we wouldn't have to worry about the car bill that's due next week and stuff like that. And we could just focus more on the clients and not have to be stressed about how we're going to keep paying our bills. So y'all might see this and be like, wow, like I can really relate to this. I can really, feel what this service provider is saying. And even though the service providers that participated in the study were in LA County and Orange County, I think that the findings of this report can really be useful nationally. Next slide. So some recommendations from staff in our study included, number one, living wage salaries. They all had, when we actually asked a question where we're like, hey, just pie in the sky, if you could have your ideal salary, what would it be? And I think the average was around 68K, which at the time was a living wage and around the living wage of LA County and Orange County. So it's not even that much. It's a huge difference from what they're getting paid right now. But I think it points to show that service providers really know what a living wage is and how a living wage could really support their lives and the work that they do. They also want more comprehensive benefits, including coverage for family members and part-time employees, expanding paid time off by creating wellness days and encouraging staff to take vacation, improvements to schedules and workloads, and building an open and supportive culture of survivors on staff. So that last one, a lot of folks expressed kind of like this taboo amongst their agencies where, it was like unspoken rules about hiring survivors, or they had to be 2 years or 3 years past their experience to be able to work at their agency, or it was kind of like a don't ask, don't tell type of environment. So folks really are craving an open and supportive culture where they can be a survivor on staff. And that doesn't mean that they want to necessarily disclose. It just means that it's something that is accounted for when it comes to workplace practices, benefits, and all of that. Next slide. So what is FreeFrom doing and sharing in this space? This is always the most exciting thing. So one of the most recent things that we did is that we moved our salary floor. So that means that everybody who is working at FreeFrom at minimum gets paid 85K, which is a living wage here in LA. And we continue to move that as the living wage calculator moves. So we use the MIT living wage calculator, so you can do a quick Google search to find that. But that's how we kind of measure what is a living wage in LA and make sure that we match it. We also do other things like bring your kids to work policies, 100% covered health, vision, and dental insurance for both the employee and their children, unlimited menstrual leave, gender-based violence paid and protected leave. So some states have protected leave for survivors. We added it's paid. So folks at our agency get paid and don't have to worry about losing income while trying to get safe because an incident happened. We have building wall stipends. So we have a few stipends like a tech stipend, like wellness stipend that folks can use to access therapy or to any wellness services that they need, as well as investment stipends. So like people who need help with a down payment, whether it's for a rental or a house, et cetera, et cetera. So we have both those, the wealth stipends and the personal and professional growth stipends. We have unlimited paid vacations and a vacation stipend, which comes real handy in helping folks really feel motivated to take vacation, and 5% company match of 401k. So if anybody's interested in learning more about these or how to implement them at your agency, definitely contact me and I'd be happy to share.
Tanya, I love this slide so much. I feel like it just helps so much in thinking about, that pie in the sky, like you were saying before. If you could have anything, what would it be? And I feel like a lot of that is what is included on this screen. And I want to uplift Angie's most recent comment in the chat about a thriving wage, so people can get a cup of coffee, go on vacation, and save for retirement. There should be no shame in that. Absolutely. Especially for folks who are doing life-saving and life-changing work too. So I really appreciate you being so open about sharing what your own organization is doing and how you all are open to helping the rest of us come along too. And Ashley, I think now would be a good opportunity to have another question for our audience.
Yes, Tori. Coming out of this just amazing conversation that Tanya is leading us through, we'd love to know from you all, what would it mean for sexual and intimate partner violence prevention and survivor support if sexual and intimate partner violence organizations prioritize the economic security of everyone working in this movement? What happens when it comes to prevention, when it comes to supporting survivors, if our organizations really prioritize economic security for the folks who are doing this work. And Michael says it would be a game changer. I agree. I also have to say, Tanya, the last slide where you talked us through what the benefits look like working at FreeFrom, that's kind of how I learned about you all. Sometime, I don't know, I've lost track of time in the last, however many months, but there was a point where I think it was a Twitter thread that was really being shared a lot around social media. And that's how I came to learn about the work that you're doing. And then, beyond all of the amazing benefits that you have, I learned about the really important work that you're doing and got to access your reports and have just come to really look to you all as kind of like this beacon of light. But I have to say that, just like putting my personal experience doing this work at local and state level agencies for many years, I was like, whoa, how would my life have been different if I had access to some of these things? And so I'm thinking probably others here today are having similar thoughts. Tori, I'm seeing things come up in the chat. Have you had a chance to look at any of them? I'm doing that now.
Yeah. Emily says a healthy group of helpers who aren't constantly pouring from an empty cup. Absolutely. I think that would be, so game changing. I also see that, this is what folks are already asking for. The saying is that we don't get into this industry or into this line of work to get rich, but like Michael says, we got to make rent and other related things for those of us who are working here or working in this movement. I also see from Lauren, more survivors can afford to be in this movement, more Black, Indigenous, and people of color survivors, higher representation of those who experience it in working too. So many cannot afford this work because we are underpaid and overworked, and their voices are being lost. Ashley, have you had a moment to find some other things too?
Yeah, I really, I love these points that folks are making. I think Gerald says, minimize the evolving door of employees. I've seen that so much too. There's so much turnover, and it's really hard when so many of our prevention strategies are really focused on relationship building. And when folks are constantly leaving, that trust is lost and you have to kind of start over. I think Kaylee's point about burnout would be less. Angela says we'd be much more effective. So, I think it's so important for us to kind of think like, what are the possibilities? And now we're starting to have these real life examples of how this actually could work in practice. And so, Tanya, that's why you being here today is just like, it's so valuable because we haven't had this for so long. It's really just been kind of like a thought. So I'll turn it back over to you, Tori and Tanya.
Thanks, Ashley. So Tanya, I know another part of your work is about building collective power. It's more than just one agency doing it. It takes a lot of us. So can you describe to us what collective power is and how that relates to some of the Survivor Safety Fund work that you do?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for everybody who is honestly sharing in the chat. I know that it's not something that we often talk about, but I think it's so important for us as service providers to talk about more. So thank you all. But yes, let's move into the collective power piece. So collective power, next slide, please, because it explains what collective power is really building a survivor-led movement. It's a collective voices. So all the collective voices of survivors with shared experience uniting to bring about change on the local and federal level. It's storytelling through data and research that centers and uplifts survivors of marginalized groups. And it's also really giving survivors the ability to create community, because we all know that so often community is one of the things that we lose when we are subjected to violence. So I'd love to learn, how are you currently supporting survivor create collective power in the chat as I move through this section. So next slide, please. So our Survivor Safety Fund is one of the ways that we do this. So we have given over 7,200 survivors cash grants, and the cash grants on average were about 244 over the last year. The only requirements for our safety funds were to self-identify as a survivor of gender-based violence, and we have a very, very inclusive definition of what this means. So, for example, people who've experienced it as a child and maybe grew up with it in their home, as a person who maybe was system impacted, so experienced violence at the hands of like police or other authorities like that. So it's a really, really inclusive, and I think that was really helpful in supporting folks self-identify as a survivor, even if survivor wasn't necessarily the word that they used to describe the experiences that they were subjected to, but that really helped. And then the other requirement was a safe way to receive the money. That is it. Those were the only requirements. And then from that, we really practice a trust-based giving model, which means that survivors could use the money however they wanted. We did not require a follow-up on what that money was for, or required proof or receipts, or had a list of vendors, none of that. We really trusted survivors to know how to best use their money and trusted them. We did send an optional follow-up survey because we knew a lot of funders were going to be asking, specifically funders or people who were hesitant to do this work, like how did survivors use it? So we asked we sent out an optional survey, and surprisingly, we had pretty good responses. But for those of you who are worried about what survivors use this money for, most of them most commonly used it for food and utilities, so household utilities. So like things like phone bills, rent, stuff like that. Next slide. And I want to leave you with some quotes here about, or not leave you, but give you some quotes here. I'm going to read the second one from a survivor who got a safety fund and then was able to do that optional follow-up. The cash came in just in time to fix my car. Not having a vehicle makes it difficult to get groceries. I use EBT, so I can't order online. Also, my child's dad has threatened to keep her or change custody when I don't have transportation to drop her off at the court order time and location. So the timing of this grant came as a huge relief. And it was interesting because on the service provider end, when we were doing the research, somebody gave the example about how somebody needed a car fix. One of their clients needed their car fixed, but they had to use an approved vendor list in order to have that be paid off. And just how challenging and how time consuming it was to find somebody on that vendor list, and how more expensive it was to use somebody on a vendor list versus this person who received this grant was just able to get the money and go do it quickly, so that it didn't affect their ability to have custody over their child, which I think really paints that image of like survivors really know how to use their money and demystifies this idea that survivors don't know how to use money. And they know what they need to stay safe. And in this case, this person needed to fix their car, and that's exactly what they did. So next slide. So FreeFrom released 2 reports on flexible cash grants about what we've learned so far about providing survivors with grants. Our last safety fund round closed in 6 hours. So we went from like a 2-week application, an application that was open for 2 weeks, to an application that was open for like 2 days, or an application that was open for 12 hours. And then the last round, because we do them in rounds, so every few months when we raise enough money, we'll open it up. The last one closed in 6 hours due to the high demand, and we currently have 2,000 survivors on our wait list. So our hope is to encourage more agencies, so like y'all on this call and on this conference, and institutions to create their own flex fund programs or redesign existing grant programs to be more flexible. And you can read about all our recommendations from the information that we collected from survivors in these 2 reports. So the first one is just data to support flexible cash funds. And the second one is 7 steps to ensure flex cash grants are survivor-centered and the data to support it. So I really encourage y'all to check it out, and please let us know if you have any questions or are interested in getting some help from us on this. The wait list is currently closed. So we had to close it because we had such a high demand. So we're actively fundraising to be able to provide grants for those 2,000. But again, the hope is that more people do this. So it's not just FreeFrom. And really we can start meeting that demand nationally as a movement. So survivors come together in a peer-to-peer setting focused on achieving financial freedom, building community while sharing and receiving resources that encourage healing, safety, financial security, and overall well-being. So these are our survivor-led peer-to-peer financial support groups. They are independent of any agency. And this is separate from the safety fund. So these are really started to really, again, trust survivors and really honor our experiences, honor our knowledge, honor our communities, and really bring survivors to come together and support each other. So that means that an agency isn't necessarily leading these peer groups. These are all survivor-led, all community-based. So it's almost like a PFLAG or an AA kind of group gathering of survivors, where they talk about different financial topics, really support each other. So for example, there's been groups that are like, hey, like, you know, with COVID, I lost income. What are y'all doing to kind of subsidize this income? And in those peer groups, other survivors can give examples or ideas or support that survivor, so on and so forth. And this is specifically also to help people who are in rural communities who don't have access to traditional services so that they can still get support from other survivors. If you're interested in learning more about this, or you are a survivor or know of a survivor who may want to join or start a peer group, you can contact M. Jackson, whose email is on this slide. Next slide. I'm gonna skip a little bit over this, but pretty much peer-to-peer groups are flexible. Again, everything we do is based on trusting survivors to navigate their own healing, their own financial, and their own support. So that goes for this program as well. Next slide. And then we have our survivor-centered savings program. So this is a new program that we just piloted. And again, it's a trust-based survivor-centered savings program where survivors get matched up to $40 a month for a consecutive 6 months. And when we say trust-based reporting system, it means that we don't ask for, like, example, a screenshot of a bank account, or we don't ask for like any proof. We just trust that survivors are going to self-report how much they're actually saving and then match them based on that number, which again eliminates a restriction like needing a bank account. I think a lot of us that work with survivors know all the challenges that come along with banking and survivorship, and how that's not always easy to do. It's not always easy to have or maintain a bank account when you are a survivor who experienced economic abuse. So this really allows us to meet survivors where they're at and provide them with the ability to create a habit of saving and have that savings if an emergency happens. And again, if you wanted more information on this, you can contact M. Jackson. I don't know if this is open nationally. This might be on an invite-based like invitation-based type of enrollment right now, but if you're curious, you can always contact them. Next slide.
Thank you, Tanya. And all of this information about how survivor-centered your work is really inspirational, and really just kind of just setting a roadmap again for what folks can aspire to do in their communities. There's a clear need for this based on how quickly your last round filled up and how big your wait list is and needing to close that. And I'm just really grateful to have you on this web conference to share these transformational things that you all are doing, so that can impact the ways that others are preventing and responding to violence. I know for this last little bit of the web conference, you wanted to tell us some of the things that FreeFrom is doing around systems change.
Yeah. So systems change is pretty much thinking about what are the systemic barriers to financial security and wellness that exist in our country at the US. So that looks like policies, government, racism, carceral responses, all those systems, and what systems need to change in order for survivors to be able to access financial equity. So next slide, please. So one of the most exciting things that we also recently launched is FreeFrom's National Survivor Financial Security Map and Scorecard. You can go to the website dropped in the chat to check it out. Next slide. But pretty much what it is that it offers accessible, plain language information about the laws in each state that impact survivors' ability to build and protect their financial security. So you can go on it, you can go check out how your state does. Let me tell you, not a lot of them are doing great right now when it comes to survivor financial support. There are some very, very exciting things to watch and things you can watch on the map. You can also make suggestions. You can also make corrections. So if you notice that something on your state we haven't updated, you can totally send us a note and we can correct it. But really, it's a tool to engage survivors, stakeholders, everybody, and being more active in the lawmaking policy advocacy space. You can live tweet at your representatives, at your governor about certain things on the map. So it's a really great tool to check out and really learn about how you can get more connected to this work, but also for survivors. I definitely encourage for y'all that work with survivors who are interested in getting more involved in policy advocacy. This is a great tool for them to kind of feel it out and know what's going on here in this space. Next slide. So expanding the ecosystem of support is another big important goal of the systems change work. And the reason for this is because 71% of survivors were not currently seeking services at a DV or sexual assault org when they applied for a safety fund grant. And if you remember, that was like 7,200 people. So out of all that, about 71% are not currently receiving services at a DV or SA org, which is really hard to hear. And there's many different reasons. So for example, folks of color are less likely to get services at a non-culture-based agency. People who are the LGBTQ community are less likely to receive services at a DV and SA agency. Indigenous people are less likely to engage with a DVSA org, et cetera, et cetera. So that is why when we talk about expanding the ecosystem of support, we're really talking about who else can we bring into the solution outside of the DV and SA world or the anti-violence world, so that survivors have more access points to support, safety, and financial resources. Next slide. So an example, I'm only going to give one, but you can go on our website and our reports, you'll find more about this. But for example, employers can do so much more. And I think we talked a little bit about what they can do in the anti-violence space, but also private sector employers can do so much more. So 70% of the survivors that participated in our data collections have never sought support from an employer as a survivor. 59% of those who have sought support received no help or reported the support they received was unhelpful. 47% would seek support if they knew services and support for survivors were available from their employer. And we have different sectors like what banks can do, what religious institutions can do, and data to support it. So definitely, I think this is in our first report, in our Trust Survivors report. If not, it's a separate report in our report section of our website. But if you're curious about how different private sectors can be more intentional about working with survivors and supporting survivors, this is a great place to start. But again, really thinking about what can employers do, which leads to the next slide. So steps employers can take: implement a survivor paid leave policy. So not just a protected leave policy, but a paid. So we can accidentally do a lot of economic harm when we are like expecting for a survivor to take unpaid time off to go deal with whatever is happening, because maybe their harm doer is causing issues for them again, or they're not feeling safe. We're telling them, okay, your job will be here, but for all that time, you're not going to get paid. And really thinking about how in that time, economic abuse can be getting worse, their debt can be getting worse, and they don't have any income. So really implementing survivor paid leave policies, which right now is not enforced by the law, but being different in this space is really important, and not really looking to what other employers are doing, because guess what, we're not doing very great when it comes to supporting survivors. So really thinking about how can we really be intentional about working with survivors and paying them when they are dealing with IPV and gender-based violence issues is a great way to do that. And then there's others like creating savings matching plans for employees, offering emergency grants, flexible and scheduled work environments, covering childcare, so on and so forth. But for the sake of time, I will go into our closing next. Oh, I had banks. Sorry about that. So I guess I did have banks. Yeah, so there's banks in here. So if you have time to check out banks in the PowerPoint, definitely do. There's some very clear ways about how banks can also be more survivor informed and provide survivor services to help in this space. So closing. So we talked a lot about difficult, challenging topics that maybe brought up all sorts of feelings, thoughts, and ideas for you as a service provider and as maybe a survivor. So I want you to write them down, draw them out, sit with them, make a to-do list, talk about them with someone, give them space in whatever way is meaningful to you. I want you to make the intention that maybe you're not ready to come to these feelings, thoughts, and ideas in this moment, but maybe allow yourself to come back to it, maybe in a few days, in a few weeks, in a year, whenever you're ready. But just know and honor all those feelings, thoughts, and ideas. Then take a few deep breaths, move your body. If you've been sitting in a chair, maybe get up, look away from your computer, drink water, and or grab a snack and think through your last thoughts. Thank you all. And my email is here in case you want to contact me. Thank you all so much for sharing space with me. And please, please, please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Tanya. We really appreciate you taking the time to share so much with our audience today. I know that some folks are having some questions in the chat, but we only have a couple minutes left. So Ashley, I'm going to hand it over to you for how we want to facilitate the last couple minutes.
Thanks, Tori. Well, thank you so much, Tanya. I know you have, and Tori posted your email in the chat, I believe. So you have been gracious in, welcoming people to contact you. And I think that we might do some follow-up with you if you're willing to have another brief conversation with us. I can see maybe posing some of these questions and writing a blog or something. So we'll talk to you about that. But I did just want to really thank you for bringing this conversation to our community, because it really does intersect and highlight ways that we can advance our primary prevention practice. And it's not, we don't typically talk about or focus so heavily on how we support survivors on Prevent Connect web conferences, even though that is at the heart, of course, of all of our work. But we're always just thinking about preventing violence from happening in the first place, when we know that there are survivors already everywhere, right? And I think that you shared that in such a way that reminded us that we might be survivors, we're working with survivors within our own organizations, and we're trying to prevent there from being additional survivors as we move through the years. But I'm just really grateful for this conversation. So I think that we will follow up with you on some of these questions. We also are going to create a list of all of the resources that have been shared, because there were quite a few. And so we'll make that available also to our audience. We'll send out a follow-up email to you all with some of this information. So stay tuned for that. I did briefly just want to invite Sheena and Casey back in for any closing remarks that you all might have at NRCDB.
Hi, thanks for inviting us. So grateful just to be in this space and for all the wisdom that Tanya has shared, and also the space to just allow us to process the feelings that I think this raises for many of us. So nothing really bombastic to add, just feeling grateful for all of this and hoping that we can all sort of take something with us from the webinar today. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I was just so, excited, for lack of better words, to just see how people were making so many connections around the various different pieces of economic sustainability and housing and racism and so forth. So just glad to be in community with you all today to hear about the very impactful work that FreeFrom is doing, and then to also hear about some of the work that you all are doing as you shared in the chat. And just much appreciation for those of you all who did share your various different personal experiences around economic supports and security.
Thanks, Sheena. Thanks, Casey. Well, Tanya, thank you again. I think, we're all just have so many thoughts and things to continue to dig into coming out of this. I really encourage you all to take a look at all of the reports and all of the data that's available on FreeFrom. There's so much more. I think we could have probably done like a whole day of this conversation. And I also thanks Arlene for highlighting. I do want to thank you all for sharing all of the wisdom, all of your insight, all of your experience in the text chat. These web conferences would not be anything without that. And so we're just always so grateful and thankful to you all. With that, we will go ahead and end this conversation for today. Again, it was recorded, so we'll make sure you know when that recording is available. And like always, if you have any questions or need anything from us, please feel free to contact us at info@preventconnect.org. Thank you all to our guests, to Tori, thank you, and to our captioners, and we'll see you all on an upcoming web conference. Take care, everyone.